This is the Scottish Club Rugby Podcast. The Scottish Club Rugby Podcast. With Stuart Cameron and Dale Clancy.
Hello and welcome to episode 31 of the Scottish Club Rugby Podcast, and in the programme this week we take a look back at what happened last Saturday in the Inter-District Championship and the National League Cup and the other games that were played as well, quite a few postponed due to Storm Kathleen as well, and we're looking ahead to the semi-final of the Scottish Cup involving Hawick and Currie, and also of course it's Melrose Sevens weekend, so we'll be taking a look at that too with Stuart McFarlane, our guest on this week's programme, but not the only one. Dale Clancy here as usual. And let's start with a look back at the Inter-District Championship, which went to the South, making it 3 out of 3 for them. A 36-18 win at Inverness against Caledonia Reds, while in the other game at Braidholme, it finished with a victory to Glasgow in the West by 29 points to 24 over Edinburgh.
Yeah, it was a really exciting championship. You know, obviously going into the last weekend, you know, one of three teams could eventually been victors, but we obviously made the trip up to Inverness. You know, we've been covering the South of Scotland's Inter-District Championship campaign, and first and foremost, what a great setup it is up at Highland. It was a long journey there and back, especially sitting beside you, Stuart. But you know, it was a rewarding one. I thought the rugby was really good, the hospitality and the welcome up there was great, and I think it showed everything that was really positive about the championship as a whole. But you know, with 40 minutes gone, with the wind that was there, you know, you've seen the posts were bowing in the wind, and it was really challenging conditions, but the wind was actually so strong it probably forced both teams to play a little bit more with the ball in hand. It made it a really good game. So after 40 minutes you didn't know really still where the championship was going to go, but in the second half the South really controlled it. I think Matty Douglas made the changes at the right time. You know, the players came on and made an impact. Obviously Russell Anderson straight away after half time scoring in the corner, but when you brought the likes of Terry Logan and Grant Shields on in the forwards, they did make a real impact in that game. And they probably, you know, Doug Crawford obviously got our man of the match, but they brought Andy Tate on a little bit later in the game, which you know was probably showing how well Doug Crawford was playing, because you know you probably wanted a more controlling scrum half on at the time. But yeah, a good job done for South of Scotland. Great to see them get their hands back on the championship. I think going into it, they were probably slight favourites, but all the teams were really strong, and obviously it was another great game at Braidholme between Glasgow and Edinburgh as well. Another tight affair, but you know, I think building on it, going into next season as well, you know, finding its place in the calendar, I think it's only going to go from strength to strength.
Certainly is, and of course last week you mentioned it about the ball in hand and keeping it there, and it was noticeable that the last try of the game, in fact the last play of the game, 24 phases right from their own 22, and the control that they had over that to eventually get it to Callum Rennick and dot down. They were initially just playing down the clock, obviously ended up as a try. Yeah,
they didn't have any other option because it was so tight. You know, with about 5 minutes to go, if they were to try and kick into that wind, you know, concede a bit of territory and give the ball back to Cali, any sort of points would have got their tails up and given them a glimmer of hope to get a victory. But, you know, the South just starved them. I think at the time they were probably looking to just try and maintain and retain possession, but they managed to find some holes in the defence. But, you know, I think there's got to be a lot of plaudits. You know, you have conversations with people about the Inter-District Championship, and a lot of players obviously being taken away from the club game. But you look at some of those players that played, and I think there's got to be a mention of Mitchell in the centre for Cali and McFarlane in the second row. They were brilliant, and they play for Aberdeenshire and Strathmore. So, you know, not some of the big household names in Scottish Club Rugby. And then you've got Mark McCormick as well for Glasgow playing in the back row. He's got this man of the match on the second occasion. You know, watched him play against Peebles. He's a formidable player, but both home and away, he's a really good player. So, you know, these players were getting a chance to mix it with players that are regularly playing at the Premiership. And I think because there's a bit of snobbery when you look at teams like that and you think that the players are probably not going to be at the standard, but there's something keeping those players at that club. And, you know, when you put them in a different environment, Colin Sangster said it as well, put them in a different environment and allow them to flourish with players who are a little bit of a higher level throughout the whole squad. You know, it's certainly been a great championship for that as well. But, you know, at the end of that game, as you say there, I think the South of Scotland were just finding some tired legs. The depth of that squad for Cali probably wasn't as deep as what the South's was, so they were able just to kind of keep attritionally working their way up the park, and eventually got the rewards from that try from Callum Rennick.
And a great showcase as well for some of the players, like you mentioned, from Strathmore and Newton Stewart and other clubs as well. I mean, Preston Lodge from Scott Clark, I think it was, playing for Edinburgh. He's now in the shop window.
Yeah, I think there is that. It's going to take a bit of time to evolve, but these players need to put themselves in an environment where they can progress their career. And we're talking about taking away the Super Series. What does Inter-District Championship replace? You see the offside line, team of the championship as well. And you think, would that be your Scottish Club International? Things will change over 12 months. We know they will. But you look at the squad, and it was even the makeup of that is strong. It's up for interpretation as to who gets the nod in some positions. But I think it probably was quite evident that across the board, some players played really well, some didn't, and it was quite equal across all the teams. And on any other day, the South could have probably left the championship with one win. Gala, I think the win against them was always on the cards. When we watched the duration of the game, they were never really in doubt. But you look at the Edinburgh and Glasgow games, and the South had backs to the wall for a lot of the periods in that game. And it was the defence, which I think is probably something we might touch on a little bit later on. But obviously the defensive resilience in that South squad is what's probably given them the championship at the end of the day.
Very interesting, though, to note at the end of that particular match and at the end of the Inter-District Championship, because the discussion is now open about where it fits in next season. And I think we were all pretty unanimous that with the Club International on the cards and the fact that it's more likely to see a Club International during Six Nations, that we have to move the Inter-District to January, which is the position, I think, for the South and possibly Edinburgh. If you are going to welcome an international on board, then and it has to be at that time, then you really have to move it.
Yeah, I think probably in light of that, it does need to be there. The one thing that infuriates me about Scottish Club Rugby as a whole is there's always so many different opinions, which sometimes actually it really hinders progress. And this is something that would hinder progress with this competition. You'll look at it. What did we say about Kelso? Maybe about 1,700 people there. And how many was there on Saturday? Would you be saying about 1,100 maybe? Plus all the eyes that watch your coverage. You've got a big audience watching this. So to then hinder the progress of this competition by not agreeing on a date, which then allows a chance for these players to go on and play at a higher level and experience new things. For me, the sensible approach is to put it in the kind of December-January slot and allow it to feed into that Club International. But just hopefully, the people who influence and make these decisions, hopefully they can butt their heads together, swallow a bit of pride as well, and just come up with the best solution for the benefit of the Scottish club game. Really, that's what it needs to be done, and a lot less infighting would be good, and it would help the progress of this competition and allow it to evolve.
If there was a Club International dangling as a carrot to the players, they're going to follow that, surely.
Yeah, definitely. I think no matter where in the calendar it lies, you'll still see the same players wanting to play, but you think about that festive period, and I know it might not land on it, but could you imagine a South versus Cali game on Boxing Day, or in between that window between Christmas and New Year? People are scratching about looking for some good rugby, and seeing something like that with two top quality teams, I'd be first at the gates going to try and take that in. So there's a real product there, I think, in terms of this Inter-District Championship, and if it lands in the right period, I think it will get good backing.
OK, well, only half the quarter-finals were played. The others will be played this Saturday. So we had Allen Glen's 29, Howe Fife 21 in the All-National 3 tie. And then Preston Lodge, who've just been promoted to Division 2, 27 for them. And Falkirk 32. Falkirk without Connor Falls and Harry Russell as well, which we both actually thought might affect it. Preston Lodge being at home as well, having a great season. They got this last-minute try, which kind of put the gloss on the scoreboard, but Falkirk getting through there. So we got that wrong, but I think we got Allen Glen's right.
We knew it was going to be a competitive game, and I think that obviously Preston Lodge have went into that game at the weekend on a bit of a high, because they've obviously clinched promotion, and I think their squad was certainly up for it, looking at the socials that they've got. But Falkirk are, they were almost getting promoted from the division above. So there is a gap in quality between the two sides. But obviously at the weekend it wasn't too much. A score at the death, I don't think it adds gloss to the scoreline. It probably illustrates it was a tighter game than perhaps some people expected it to be. But the inclusion of Connor Falls, who I thought was a really good weapon for Cali Reds at the weekend, and obviously Harry Russell, who was the captain of that regional side, they were obviously big losses for Falkirk. So they'll be chuffed a bit that those players are going to come back into the fold for the semi-final, and they'll get a tilt to try and get to Murrayfield.
In the other game that was played, it was Murrayfield Wanderers 22, Garnock 82 in National 4. Other games were postponed, no doubt due to Storm Kathleen. But in the Border League, Hawick, well, they're the champions after Gala failed to get a win at home to Kelso. That means they can't be caught now, and they've now won the Border League for a record 51st time. Very impressive.
Yeah, obviously breaking their own record. Was there obviously the occasion where they beat Kelso for the 50th a few seasons ago, and obviously getting their 51st. It's a great accolade, and obviously Melrose, I think, are the second closest with 20. So there's quite a gulf between obviously the history of the Border League between those two sides. But you know, Hawick have got bigger fish to fry now as they move on to other things, you know, in the up and coming weeks.
Well, of course, on Tuesday this week, Hawick issued a statement saying that their head coach Matty Douglas had resigned with immediate effect after being told that his services were no longer required next season, despite the fact that he's finished top of the Premiership 2 seasons running, oversaw the winning of the Scottish Cup last season, and they're in the semi-finals of the Cup competition again this season, as well as the Premiership final playoff. Now, Hawick went on to announce Graham Hogg as the head coach for the remainder of the season, with assistance from Roddy Deans and Scott McLeod. That's all in the public domain now, so it would be wrong for us to ignore that, of course. And to provide balance, Matty has also issued a statement saying how proud he was of the opportunity to be head coach. He went on to say the decision by the club came as a complete surprise. He was unhappy that the decision was made without discussing his own options for the future, and referenced a lack of respect towards him, which ultimately was what made him resign. He also referenced a confidential team survey which was undertaken without his knowledge, and therefore he had no alternative but to resign. Now, we're very close with Matty. We're also very close with Hawick Rugby Club. Certainly very sad to see this kind of thing happening.
Outside looking in, and when you take the information that you get from both parties, and obviously the rumblings and the jungle in the south of Scotland as well, I think the way that it's been handled is not great. I think the timing of it was very awkward for Hawick as a rugby club, you know, to issue that statement that came as a surprise. And I think the way that there's a confidential survey being done of the players, it's quite underhanded, and you know, that's a shame for Matty. And first and foremost, you've got to look after the individual, and I think that in this, you've got to remember that there's a whole club. On the face of it, looks like they've turned away from an individual, and I think there's been little care of his kind of his well-being. But on the rugby side of things, which is what I concentrate on, is that Hawick are in a really, really good position on the field. So, you know, obviously they've got the semi-final of the Cup coming up. They've got the Prem final as well. 2 big games against Currie. So it puts a little bit of pressure on Hawick in terms of going into those games as a new coaching setup. I think the inclusion of Roddy Deans and Scott McLeod are going to be pivotal, because they're really experienced coaches in various aspects. Obviously, Roddy's got experience from the kind of age grade national setup and at Merky, and Scott McLeod's been coaching down at Newcastle Falcons. So, you know, what a pedigree to bring in. Obviously, they'll be supporting Graham Hogg as well, who's been in that environment for a while. So, you know, they've probably done well to transition out of what has been a really awkward period to get a really stable coaching setup in place. Now, for Matty Douglas, obviously he's in a position where he's a bit of a crossroads. He's put in a lot of hard work over the last few years to get Hawick to a position that they're in. There's probably been a mix of a bit of luck with some of the players that they've had coming back. You know, he's been blessed with talent. But I said it before about the south of Scotland. You know, what made them win that championship was their defensive resilience. And in Matty's statement, he puts pride on his defence, and I think that's some of the things that have changed. You probably could put other coaches in there that would focus more on the attacking capabilities of Hawick and neglect the defensive one, and that could be the difference between them, you know, winning and losing championships. Now, Matty's won a double. You know, he was probably in the cusp of certainly going in his favourites to win another double. There'll be people wanting to, you know, get his services going for 28 years old. You know, there's a lot of time in his career, and as unfortunate as it is, this will be a big learning curve for Matty, and what will hopefully be a long and successful coaching career, and how that looks, if it's at the club game, semi-pro, pro, wherever he goes, you know, he'll probably look back on this and notice there's been a lot of lessons that he's learned which are going to help him. If he's going to be successful in the future, he'll lean heavily on these experiences, and it'll make him a better individual. Now, of course, there'll be a lot of Hawick fans who'll be looking towards, you know, these really vital matches in the next few weeks or so, and you've been in a Peebles team when you were playing, and coaches were coming and going, where, you know, the sackings all the time. You know, they've happened in the past, they'll happen in the future. It's part of sport. But as a player, when
you were in a team like that. How distracting was it when there was a change?
Sometimes it was a real positive. There was one time that I can really reflect on. A coaching setup was in at Peebles. It just wasn't working at all, and it was dated. It just wasn't fit for purpose. And I think the group of players just weren't reacting in the right way. You know, it wasn't nasty in any way. It was just the fact we weren't performing because, you know, the guidance and the message was wrong, and you weren't buying into it. So if you're not buying into it, you're going to kind of keep yourself at a distance. And the change actually happened. One of our players, our more experienced players, started to transition into coaching then. Stripped it back to basics, knew the boys really well, knew the strengths and weaknesses of the players and individuals. He was really approachable as well, which helped. And actually, because he had a lot of respect initially in that cohort, we actually played really, really well in the next couple of games. There was a point where we were playing, I think it was Stirling County, who were getting promoted out of our division. We had to play them elsewhere. The Gates was not playable, but we ran them really close, where before we went up to Bridgehaw and got our pants pulled down and got slapped in the bum. So we actually had that real positive reaction, and that's what Hawick's going to need. You know, it's obviously with looking at it, with what's happened, they've got rid of a really successful coach. He's came in and he's done a remarkable job, Matty. So obviously Hawick are now transitioning out that period and having to go into a new one on the cusp of a new premiership as well. So, you know, there's changes. I think the transparency is something that is probably irking people a little bit more, because it was pretty much cut and dry, no further comment. There was nothing to add. There was more questions than answers. But I think now, again, as I must say, as unfortunate as it is, at least we've got some answers. We know that they've got a new coaching setup in. They are where they are. We can start concentrating on stuff on the field, and I must say I do wish Matty the best in the future, wherever he does end up. And it's the same for Hawick. I wish them, you know, the best going into their semis and their Prem final, because I've been lucky to be involved with some really memorable moments with Hawick over the last few years, which I'm happy to have covered, and, you know, I want more of them as well. So this is definitely not a slight on either party. It's the fact that we just want a positive out of it, and hopefully moving forward there's positives on both sides.
And certainly a safe pair of hands with Graham Hogg and Scott McLeod and Roddy Deans as well. They will certainly get the boys focused and ready for Currie.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of respect there from that cohort, because of the history of certainly Roddy and Scott McLeod. Scott McLeod has kind of been there already and helping out. Hoggy's been in that environment for the last couple of years. It looks like he's got the respect of the players as well, so he's off to a really positive start. His coaching credentials perhaps are quite early. You know, he's got a lot of rugby experience, Graham. But obviously in a job like Hawick, he's probably not had that yet. You know, he's been involved as director of rugby at Hawick. You know, it's a big task, but he's going to be. I've said it before. He's going to be really well supported. I think Roddy's he's a really knowledgeable rugby guy. Scott McLeod as well comes with a really strong coaching pedigree. So whether this is the coaching setup going into next season, and maybe they're trying to just use these two games, they've kind of made their bed. They have to lie in it. And whether they're going to come out of it with a new coaching setup and go, look, we were right, and this has worked out for us, it remains to be seen. But Hawick go into these two games with a really strong coaching setup and a really good, really strong, powerful group of players.
We will, of course, be having full commentary of that match. Robin Purdy and Ewan Welsh will be down at Mansfield Park. That's right in the middle of the Melrose Sevens, but we will juggle it, and we will certainly be breaking off for that game, so you won't miss anything. Very important match at Mansfield Park between Hawick and Currie. Now, the winners will meet either Marr, Edinburgh Accies or Heriots Blues. Marr, of course, through to the semi-final already. Accies and Heriots will play their quarter-final this Saturday at Raeburn Place, 2 o'clock kick-off.
Obviously, it just shows the fixture congestion, but again, a really interesting group of fixtures coming up, because those teams that are all left in it, you know, are some of the top 5 teams that are in the division. So obviously, Marr have already made their way through to the semi-final. You would argue that it's befitting of Marr that they're going to get themselves the chance to have a showpiece final, because obviously they turned over Currie twice but lost out to them in the playoffs, so they've got themselves in a good position in the getting to the semi-final, and they'll go into that game as favourites as well. You know, the difficulty is the distance in the fixtures and what we've had, but ultimately it's shaping up to be a really good cup final. You know, it's taken a long time to get there. I'm so disillusioned with the cup, it's unbelievable, but you know, it's got to the point where the fixtures now are meaning something. And yes, we've still got a bit of fixture congestion, but we've either got probably Hawick or Currie versus Marr, And if not, they're going to be playing one of those Edinburgh teams which have run both sides close this season.
And if you're frustrated about the Cup, what about the playoffs? Remember them? It's been a long, long time, and it's still, May? Still got another few weeks to go before the final finally gets played.
And I think that comes back to when we have these discussions about the Sevens, Inter-District Championship, the Scotland Club International, and all this rugby that we need to absorb and maintain our interest in. This doesn't help. There's a bit of a gripe there, because when you're playing on May the 4th, it's a completely different fixture to playing at the end or the middle of February.
Because the momentum's gone.
It's the momentum, and it's the pitch, and it's the coaching setup, and it's injuries after the Inter-District Championship, and it's the kind of the flogging the players for that extended period and putting them in incubation for a little bit to bring them back out. How you manage that is really challenging. So there's been a duration which is it does give you a bit of disengagement, but when the whistle goes again, when the referee blasts that whistle and we've got those fixtures coming on, you'll just be completely absorbed by it. Over the last few seasons it's been the same, and hopefully the spectators who are going to be backing these sides and rugby fans as well will make their way to the grounds and take in these big games as we come to the end of the season.
Now, other games: League Cup quarter-final, Boroughmuir against Newton Stewart, and Stirling County against Lasswade.
Yeah, I think you're looking at this weekend as well, and obviously Boroughmuir have not had the best season, but they had a good finish to it. But Newton Stewart, especially if they welcome back McCormick, they're going to be a dangerous outfit to try and thwart, because he's been man of the match in 2 of the inter-district games for Glasgow, and he's a formidable character. I said before, it's going to be interesting what this time of year does to the makeup of that team, because Newton Stewart and their location, their geography, means that I think they're very agricultural in terms of the makeup of their squad. So hopefully they don't lose a lot of personnel, because they'll be going into that game. It's a bit of a travel, as all their games are, but they'll probably going into that as favourites. And I think the same for the second game. I think the away team started as favourites. Lasswade finished the season in National 2 in really good form, beat Falkirk, albeit that they perhaps were missing the services of Falls and Russell, but Lasswade are a really strong squad and a really strong side, coached well by Peter Wright. So obviously they're a team that were unlucky not to get promoted from National 2 in the same league as Stirling County. So it might be away from home, but I think that Lasswade, will probably go into that with the edge, but anything can happen in Cup Rugby, and I'm sure Stirling will be hoping to spring a surprise.
In other games, there's one in National 3 and one in National 4, so we've got Orkney against Hamilton trying again this week, and National 4 Ross High against Strathmore. Nothing really to add to that. Yeah,
not a lot. Obviously, Hamilton and Ross High have had difficult seasons themselves, and you just matter of getting to the end of the season, so I'm sure Hamilton will enjoy their trip across the water to Orkney. And Ross High obviously have had a very, very difficult season, and they've just pretty much got to see it out now, so another challenging game against Strathmore.
Well, also on Saturday, of course, it's the Melrose Sevens at the Greenyards, a long day for us from 11 till 8 o'clock on air, 9 hours. Looking forward to it though. Yeah,
Melrose Sevens is always a great occasion, and I think obviously it's changed slightly, after COVID and the birth of the Super Series as well. It's obviously changed in its makeup, and obviously the introduction is the women's tournament was really successful last season, so it's always a big occasion, and especially for those amateur players that want to play in front of a big crowd, they do get an occasion to do that at Melrose. So obviously some different invitational teams lining up at Melrose Sevens this year, but Monaco MPs were really impressive in their victory last year with a lot of Jamaican internationals. The British Army as well, winning the season beforehand, were there and put on a good show. So the rugby's always going to be competitive, and hopefully there's a border side as well, or a club side that are able to stick their hands up. Obviously not had a club winner since Watsonians a few years ago, so obviously it's a big weekend in the rugby calendar where Rugby Sevens all began. So a chance for them to put on a bit of a show in front of a big crowd.
And it's been a while since we've had a local winner. Can we do it this time, or even a Scottish winner?
Yeah, obviously the last Scottish winner was Watsonians in 2018. Good competition that year. Obviously the club sides managed to kind of make their way through the competition. So, but before that, it's been heavily influenced by professional outfits and invitational teams since then. Going back a couple of decades, it's all names like the Saracens, and obviously you had Stellenbosch in there, Newcastle Falcons, Sale Sharks as well, and then obviously a couple of guises of the Scottish Thistles as well. So obviously it's changed slightly in the makeup. The teams that are there, the Lions Rugby, Monaco MPs, Samurai have been there before as well. So they're teams that a bit more of a modern seven slant that you would perhaps see at the bigger competitions and other competitions like of Hong Kong sevens and other Amsterdam sevens and things like that. So they're obviously trying to change it slightly in the way that it looks, but ultimately if I was still playing, I'd still be looking at when Melrose sevens was in the calendar, so you could run out and be a Peebles player, so you knew you got knocked. Who did you have in the prelims and what time we were getting knocked out.
Now, of course, in recent times, you mentioned those names: London Scottish, Harlequins, Glasgow Warriors sent teams as well, and one Edinburgh Rugby the same. These are teams and names that people do know. It's when you get like the Assassins, you get Eric Little 100, you get Lion Rugby, OG Sevens, Shogun. Obviously, Shogun is rebranded from Samurai, but the general public looking at that, those names wouldn't actually mean anything, even though they will contain some tremendous people. Yeah,
the players that they contain are really, really impressive. So, it's obviously not the quality of the quality of the squads that are there, but I think there is an element of traditionalist or traditionalism that needs to maintain in Melrose Sevens, and I think the inclusion of the professional sides that brought development teams mostly. Obviously I've had the experience of not only getting pumped by Melrose, a club team in the first round in front of about 10 or 11,000 spectators. I also got cuffed by Saracens as well, so that was the experiences that you got as a young rugby player that you were never I was never going to reach any heights in my rugby career, but that's some of the things that I look back on and think that at least I got to experience it at the Greenyards, and it was a great occasion. But for me, I do find a bit of disengagement with invitational sides, but that's sometimes the way that Sevens going, and you've got to embrace change. So I'll be there and I'll be doing a bit of research on all these teams, trying to see a bit of the history behind them all. Yeah, and trying to invest myself in the tournament. It's a bit easier when you're covering Saracens and Edinburgh Rugby, because as a general rugby punter, you're familiar with those names, and they're recognisable brands in rugby. But the Assassins, teams like that, it's a little bit different. But probably I mentioned for Durham Uni that obviously came through the prelim tournament last year, which is no longer this year. But yeah, they were a good outfit as well, and obviously there was a lot of really talented rugby sevens players in that team, and they beat a Tynedale team as well that had an ex Melrose Sevens winner who was with London Scottish before. So obviously Parker was part of that side. So there's little stories that still litter throughout Melrose Sevens, which is what it's all about. It started years ago. Obviously the birth of rugby sevens, and it's changed in ways over the time to still maintain its position in the calendar. So how it's going to look in 10 years will be pretty different as to what it is now.
It is going to be very interesting. I mean, we've just actually been handed, during this podcast, the Shogun men's Melrose squad. There's 5 Scots in there: Jamie Farndale, Jordan Edmonds, Matt Davidson, Paddy Kelly and Ross McKnight, which is strong enough. Then you've got 4 from England, including Max Pepper, who's back again, Freddie Roddick, Harrison Friday and James Reid. And then you've got Tom Roach from Ireland, another couple of English, Will Glover and Will Hendy. It's pretty strong.
Yeah, the experience of Will Glover in there is huge, but you look to the likes of Farndale as well. He's had a really successful career with Scotland Sevens. Paddy Kelly as well is a really impressive rugby player from our shores as well. So there's players there that they're Sevens players. And Jordan Edmonds, we're familiar with him. His work when he played for Boroughmuir. And he's obviously went on and had a stab at the. Obviously in the Sevens arena as well. These are players that Matt Davidson's been playing Super Series rugby for Heriots and has been, back from the Sevens makeup in international games. So all these people are really well seasoned rugby Sevens individuals. So, Shogun, I think over the last couple of years they're probably a little bit miffed that under the guise of Samurai that they missed out on winning the Melrose Sevens, and it looks like they're going full noise for this one.
They certainly are. Terry Sands there, the director of rugby, who is really putting all his eggs in one basket there, isn't he, with a squad like that, and going for another final appearance, the 3rd in a row, but this time looking to get over the line and get that gold medal. Nick Wakely from Wales, the women's Sevens coach as well, is there, and I was out in Kenya with him, got on very, very well with him and Terry as well. Really nice guys. We've got Neil Hinnigan, our own Neil Hinnigan, who's the team manager, Fraser Harkness, assistant coach, and Ross Graham from England is the physio. So even the non-players are well recognisable.
Yeah, especially like say, obviously we know Neil pretty well from our kind of coverage of rugby in the region. But even Fraser Hartness, he's a bit of a local hero in some parts, and he's had a really successful sevens career himself. He was actually, the first time I met him was looking at him as a youngster, when I was a youngster playing for Peebles, and thinking that he's not going to be much of a sevens player, and then he ran over the top of me twice, and somebody said to me in my ear, "Don't worry, it's just Herky." So he's a familiar individual from our shores, and he's passionate about sevens and passionate about his rugby. So it's good to see that we've got a couple of well-kent faces in the Shogun ranks.
So let's have a look at the first round then. Hawick against Currie. There's a familiar tie. 2 games between those two in the same day. Gala against Peebles, Jedforest versus Kelso. So very heavily weighted at the top with Borders teams. Watsonians against Boroughmuir, Shogun v Harriet, Selkirk against Edinburgh Accies. British Army have got a bye because Stirling County have withdrawn, and Glasgow Accies against Monaco Impes. And interesting that they've scrapped the seeding system this year, which means that the current winners, the current holders, Monaco, go straight in the first round.
Yeah, and obviously I've been checking their stuff out on social media as well to see what kind of squad they're bringing over. I think they're probably going to be stronger than they were last year. So, obviously still got a lot of the faces that picked up the trophy and probably surprised everybody. But I think that's because of the nature of what we've just discussed about the team names. You'd never know who's going to rock up. But obviously the seeding, which is no longer, means that there's some big ties. And obviously Glasgow Accies, Monaco Impes, you would imagine that Monaco Impes go into that as favourites. But as the tournament goes on, if they manage to get their way through that, they're going to get more and more leggy as they get through. So the teams likes of, obviously, as we say, Monaco Impes, Shogun, who are in the opening round as well, they're going to have to go full hog to obviously make sure that they get to the final in good shape, utilise their squad. And it does give some of the club teams a little bit more of a chance if they get an easier opening round. The likes of Jed and Kelso have had Kelso have had a really good season. Jed not so much, but they'll be focusing on their sevens because they've got a really good sevens cohort. So it'll be good to see some of these club teams perhaps go through the rounds and push some of these invitational sides. So
the second round, obviously, the winners of the first round ties will play Assassins, and then Durham University, who've earned their place in the Melrose Sevens. They also, of course, won the Earlston Sevens last year and have been invited back. So Earlston Sevens actually is lining up at the moment with them and obviously Scott White and his chums, Lee Jones playing with Mark Robertson and a few others as well. That's going to be quite an event on the 5th of May. I think that's happening. That's the Sunday, the day after Kelso Sevens. So Durham University are in there. Hearts and Balls, the charity team, which are pretty strong. South Barbarians, Scott White will be picking a team with Borders connections for that one. The Eric Liddell 100, it's the 100th anniversary of Eric Liddell at 1924. Back in the day, that was the Olympics in France, 1924. More from that a little bit later on when we talk to Stuart McFarlane. Melrose, of course, are in there as well. Lion Rugby and OG Sevens, who I have to confess I know nothing about. What about your research?
Not started yet. I've been a busy boy. I was at Laughing Duck Soft Play today, so I've not had a chance to obviously do a bit of research on the sevens, but yeah, I work better under pressure. I'll leave it to the end of the week.
I'm sure you'll get it all right. Ticket sales apparently quite good for the Melrose Sevens, over 5,000 according to Director of Rugby Phil Morris, who I spoke to during the week. So let's have a little listen to how that went. Phil, always good to come down to the Greenyards, have a little chat just before the big event, which seems to come around quicker every year.
Doesn't it just?
How's it all shaping up?
Yeah, looking good. We've just started the build today, so that's some of the fencing going down. So, yeah, that's us point of no return. So, lots of squad names beginning to come through. So, yeah, feels like we're not far from the Melrose Sevens once again. As you say, it comes around pretty fast.
And it is a huge task, this infrastructure, putting it all in.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's a hell of a group of people behind the scenes that do an awful lot, and guy called Alan Dawson, who for the next 2 weeks is pretty much full-time on construction. Jim, who deals with all of the health and safety and the security and the counter-terrorism and stuff that people just go, really? Do you have to? And the answer is yes. You know, that an event of this size has huge amounts in the background. So yeah, very, very lucky to have a good team.
And it's big changes, really, when you compare it with, say, 10 years ago. I mean, obviously it was a huge operation then, but the fact that health and safety is up several levels, finances up several levels, you know, it's a real struggle.
Yeah, look, I think events are evolving. The expectations, you know, from a government perspective in terms of safety, you know, things like the Manchester bomb, you know, these things have really brought a new dimension and level of professionalism that's required, and you know, we're lucky to build on what was before us, but at the same time we face a different set of challenges. Costs are going up, the police charges go up every year, the council want to charge more. You know, we're lucky to have supportive partners, but you know, everyone's got you know, tightening purse strings, and you know, the finance again is a big factor nowadays.
So it's all going to be paid for, obviously. Ticket sales, how are they going?
Yeah, we're pretty long. I think we're about 20% ahead at the moment on last year's shirts. So I expect the next. Well, in fact, I know today ticket sales I think we've sold 5,000 or something. You know, in the first sort of 7-8 hours today. So they're definitely moving pretty quickly at this point, and. Got the kids' party on Saturday night. That always sells last minute, so they're beginning to sell. So yes, it's we're hopeful for good weather. I haven't seen the exact forecast, but at the moment it's looking dry, which is the main thing. So hopefully that'll encourage more people to come and see what should be a great event.
Now, we always have a little chuckle at the feedback that is always there on social media. Some good, some bad, some a bit indifferent, some surprising. You take it all in, though, don't you?
Yeah, look, I think rugby is a sport with a lot of change going on and a lot of people with differing opinions, and you know, I guess our job is to put on a high quality event, but you know, it is impossible, it would appear, to please everybody. Yeah, we do our damnedest to put on a great event with high quality rugby, attractive to the local audience and attractive to all the visitors that are coming. And you know, I think we have to bear in mind players, youngsters, they have different requirements nowadays, perhaps from what people had sort of 10, 20, 30 and even further back. So, you know, our job is to make sure the event is relevant for them as well.
And of course everyone has a voice and they're entitled to their opinion, as you said. What are the kind of the good points? What are the things that people are constantly coming back to you and saying, yes, you've got this right?
Yeah, I think there's a silent majority that just come up and constantly sort of pat you on the back and say, you're a lunatic for taking this on, and well done. I mean, so the things that people, you know, I think they like the quality of the rugby, they like the pitch that we have now, they like the infrastructure, the fan zone has been, you know, a big success for many people. Yeah, I mean, certainly the event is seen as being relevant, and you know, I think we're trying to. One of the Sevens events in the area that is seeing almost an upturn. So yeah, I think all of that is seen as a positive, and yeah, well, we're lucky. We'll take those bits.
And what about the other side of it then? The ones that people are sort of saying, well, oh, you should be changing this or that.
I think the primary one at the moment is a feeling that the local teams can't win the event. It's a difficult one. Obviously rugby's changed, so a team like Melrose now, would they have beaten a team that Melrose would have put out 10-15 years ago? I don't know the answer to that, but you know, we have to deal with changing circumstances. You know, back in December, we didn't even know whether Super Series was going to be happening or not happening, or whether those teams would be able to play. Similarly, we've got clashes with the Cup. We're trying to make the event as interesting for anybody that's coming. So really pleased that the South Barbarians are able to come, and they look as though they're going to field a strong team, which should allow a team of some real local interest to, you know, be absolutely competitive with some of the other sides that come. I think the other side that people, you know, they've got to realise how many people want to come and play at Melrose. You know, I mean, we are constantly turning teams away who wish they could come and play in the event, and you know, it's a balance between the teams that want to come, and you know, I can't dictate how strong or weak they'll be. Some teams are stronger than others. I mean, my view's always been if you bring a good strong side to Melrose, you'll do fine.
And of course, there are guest teams again this year. A lot of great players in these sides. It's getting the message out, I suppose, of where you can find these players, because the teams themselves, there are names that people haven't understood, who they are, but they do contain some really good players.
Yeah, look, I think one of the issues we have is that sevens doesn't necessarily have the prominence that it used to have. There are seven specialists. Even Anton Dupont. He struggles to be a star in the game of sevens, having just transferred across. Michael Hooper's just been selected, I gather, for Hong Kong for the Australians. And again, it's a transition. There are guys who play sevens who are absolutely brilliant at the game of rugby sevens, who are not well-known names in the game in 15s. And ultimately, sevens is only prominent in this area for a few weeks a year. We've made a bigger effort this year to get the squad names earlier, and we're trying to, I guess, publicise a bit more publicly who some of these players are. So last year in the final, there was a Spanish sevens national player. There were, some really strong Fijian players with really, good backgrounds in the game of rugby sevens. My understanding this year is we've got a couple of GB sevens players coming. We've got a Springbok sevens player coming. So we're hopeful that we'll be able to tell their stories in the coming days.
And of course, guest teams aren't anything new. We've seen this in the past. I think the difference is we've had like London Scottishes and Ross and Parks and kind of familiar club sides, I suppose. Are they still an option for the future?
It's difficult with the likes of, I say, Saracens. These teams now, they're essentially looking for their travel to be paid, their accommodation to be paid, and potentially even their players to be paid. And as a club, we're unable at this point to do that. So, the guest sides that we are attracting are ones that are prepared to come to the Greenyards because they want to be part of the history that's here. And look, I know next year we've got one Australian club side already showing an interest in coming. I think it'd be a side that everyone would recognise. So, if they can manage to bring that together, we'd love to see them here. I think international travel is becoming easier for everyone again. I know one of the university teams is expressing an interest in coming next year. So, we're really open to whoever wants to come. And, there are no shortage of people, emailing us and asking to receive an invite.
You mentioned clashes earlier on, and of course that seems to happen every year now. It's an unfortunate situation. There's a big game at Mansfield Park, of course, happening now on April the 13th, and I guess your heart sank when that came out. That's
one of the variables that we're now facing. I mean, whether things will settle a bit more now. There's a new structure coming in the leagues, etc. We'll see. But from our perspective, all we can do is try and put on the best event we can with the cards that we're dealt.
And of course, structure is very, very important for the future as well. You're always looking to refresh things and make sure that things, happen for the for the punters who are actually coming here and paying for the product. And I think one thing that I've always mentioned to you, is, which I like the idea of, is putting the emphasis more on locals and club and Scottish rugby on, say, the Saturday, and then having the guest teams on a Sunday. There is the potential there, certainly, of making it a really good, strong weekend.
It's a balance. As you know, back in 2020, we looked at almost splitting the event and having a sort of more localised tournament focused on the Saturday, and as you say, a sort of a semi-pro, if that's the right word, which would be pools, and then into the Sunday. I think probably now, post-COVID, having rebuilt the event, I think for 2025, that's something the club should have another look at, and may well be the right option to take it forward. Some people don't like things to change, but in my view, you have to keep evolving, and we're evolving in what is quite a changing environment here in Scotland with rugby. So we've got to try and find the right place for Melrose as all that settles.
Well, the rugby on the pitch is always going to be very good, right up to the very highest standards, no doubt about that. So just finally then, what is it like for you building up to the big day?
It's getting better, I suppose. The more you practice, this is my third or fourth, can't remember how many I've done. But the team's got stronger each year, and at the end of the day, they do all the work. I tend to be the gobby one at the front of it, I guess. So it flies by, but it's exciting, and as long as the weather is good for us, then we can be. The Hall of Fame, we're inducting Carl Hogg, which should be lovely to do, and Hovis Brown, and then recognising some other characters from the game locally. And I'm really looking forward to the Friday, actually, this year. I think that'll be really good. Really nice to see both the 16s and the 18s get to play through. So, busy few days ahead, Stuart, but looking forward to it.
And you booked the weather, have you?
Always book it.
Whether it rise, another matter.
That's true.
We'll take it all in our stride. Always a pleasure. Thanks very much.
No, thanks, Stuart. Cheers.
Phil Morris, Director of Rugby Sevens at Melrose. Who would put their hand up to be Director of Rugby at Melrose Sevens? It's a tough old gig, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. It's huge, though. It's... I've said it before, it's one of the first things that you look out in the rugby calendars to see when Melrose Sevens is coming up, and it's not just about the rugby anymore. It's obviously that's the thing. The history of it is the thing that captures the imagination of everybody. But over the years, there's been lots of eyes on Melrose Sevens. Watching it on TV, watching it on the BBC. It's changed. As coverage and things have got a little bit more competitive. Melrose Sevens has had to change in its guise as well to try and keep up with the times. So obviously Phil Morris comes in with different ideas, fresher ideas. He's not scared to try stuff as well. Obviously the Hall of Fame dinner is something that is coming throughout his kind of tenure leading on the Melrose Sevens. And that's been relatively successful as well. So they've got to try different things to obviously create a little bit of longevity in the Melrose Sevens product. But not a job for the faint-hearted, and certainly not one I would be looking to put my hand up for.
Always opinions, of course, as we discussed in that interview. Some good comments, some bad comments. People say they'll never set foot in the Greenyards again, and all that kind of stuff, which is pretty emotional stuff. But he does listen to everything, and as he hinted there as well, and something I've been trying to get back to for a long time is a more traditional sevens on a Saturday. Maybe bring in an extra event on the Sunday for the semi-pros. And from what he's saying there, it's on the table.
You're right, and I think part of the thing which has seen Melrose Sevens last throughout the changes in the rugby landscape over the last couple of decades is the fact that it had that traditional element. People always flock back because of what it was. Some of the rugby that we've seen, some of the finals that we've seen, covered on TV at the time have been phenomenal. The stories, obviously Melrose winning their own sevens not that long ago, but also coming up, so short on a couple of occasions as well. They're the stories, and Jed as well. The occasion that Jed obviously got to the final and all the Borders clubs were then wanting to see Jed win it, and any other day they'll be hoping that they trip over their shoelaces and make a bit of a mockery of themselves. But that's the stuff that Melrose Sevens brings. It's the tradition in the south and at Melrose of what it was and what it is now, and I think there does need to be an element of tradition that maintains and stays, and hopefully it's able to keep that in the years to come.
And you mentioned that he is there to try and sort of keep up with the times and make changes, etc. Some will be popular, some won't be so popular, but there is an opportunity there. I mean, it used to be sort of the focus was the Saturday, but we've got events on the Thursday with the Hall of Fame. We've got the Friday with the kids now playing on Melrose, the under-16s and the under-18s. They have an after-match party, and there's potential there with the 3G pitch and the floodlights to do other things, and there's no reason why it couldn't evolve into like a weekend of top quality rugby.
Yeah, it's got to change because people want changes as well, so you can't just stand still and just expect people to arrive at the gates and it to be 10,000-12,000 people again. It's not going to happen if you're just dishing out the same product time and time again. So it needs to evolve. They changed the layout of the ground last year and had a bit more of a kind of food village, which is current. That's what people are wanting to go to events for. They want to be in an environment where they can do what they want. They're well fed, they're well looked after. Rugby's different now. It's not a matter of men flocking to a ground and leaving everything at the gates and then just downing 12, 14, 15 pints responsibly and then going home. It's a completely different atmosphere now. It's got to be a little bit more family oriented. It's got to cater to a wide, vast range of people, and that's what Phil Morris is trying to do with Melrose Sevens. for me, when you focus on the rugby, I think there's some things you would change in terms of the teams that are invited and maybe have that more traditional element. But off the field, you've got to cater and you've got to entertain, because that's what it's for. If you're not entertaining people, they're not going to be paying money to come through the gates to just visit Melrose for the sake of it. They've got to get value for money, and obviously ticket prices for an event are pretty high. But where are you going to go and get 7 hours worth of entertainment for that price? It's relevant if you balance it all up. And yes, you're going to be spending money over the bar or at a food village or whatever, but that's what you do when you go to events. When people go up to the Fringe Festival, it's exactly the same. You'll pay 30, 40 quid for a ticket to go to an event, and you'll also spend 30, 40 quid on food and drink and whatnot. So it's a day out. It's an occasion for people. The rugby sometimes is just a byproduct of what is going on round about the pitch.
Well, earlier today I caught up with commentator and colleague of ours, Stuart McFarlane, who's obviously BBC Radio Scotland's rugby commentator. He'll be calling the final on Saturday. Let's hear what he had to say. Thoughts on the Melrose Sevens, because you've been involved obviously with it for a while as a commentator, and for many years, in fact, through Radio Borders and through the BBC as well. We're now up to 2024. You've seen a few changes in that time, and of course the 3G pitch being one of them.
Yeah, I think cosmetically that's one of the most obvious changes to have been introduced in the last 4 or 5 years. And obviously you go back to Melrose Sevens of days of old, where at the second weekend in April, you never can tell what the weather's going to be like. So we've seen Melrose Sevens basking in glorious spring sunshine, but we've seen sleet and snow on a pitch at the end of a Sevens tournament that is pretty heavy, is pretty bare in patches. So, coming from that, from the maybe the 80s and 90s, my earlier memories of the tournament, to a pristine artificial surface now that is going to withstand an afternoon's play, having already had activities on the Friday night, activities on the Sunday, and many around about the days leading up to and immediately after the Sevens are played, and there's not the same requirement to plan for a pitch to endure such great demands on it these days. So I think that's one thing that we've got used to, I suppose, in the last few years. And I think as well, Stuart, one of the things that, if you think back 10 years to when you and I were at Ibrox for the Commonwealth Games Sevens in 2014, we could see that there was elements of the wider entertainment, the sort of wider fabric of the Sevens that would likely be introduced at some point in the not too distant future in Melrose, and that has come to pass as well. There's a very different sort of crowd appears now at a Melrose Sevens than perhaps did in the early mid-90s or further back than that, and I suppose the organisers needed to look and keep it fresh and keep it as a current, meaningful, attractive event for a lot of people to go and attend, because there's so much competition now, week in, week out, weekend in, weekend out, for people's attention. And people are so mobile these days. Now that we're out of COVID, they'll go far and wide to take part in various weekend activities without giving it too much thought.
Well, of course, we've heard from Phil Morris, director of the tournament, and as he said himself, a lot of people have gone up to him and said, look, why on earth have you taken it on? Because it's a thankless task. And of course, there are people who really, are still mourning the loss of the grass and the fact that we have a 3G pitch now. Putting the Melrose Sevens aside just for a second, the fact that there is a 3G pitch at Melrose, and I drive past it all hours of the night with the floodlights as well, which they now have, seeing young kids on there playing not just rugby, hockey, football, that sort of thing, and it's getting great use for the community.
Absolutely. I think that there's an interesting argument in terms of, do you use a pitch like that for training? Do you limit the amount of time any individual is actually on that particular surface if there's a risk that it is going to damage his or her joints? And do you always keep competitive matches, whether it be football, rugby league, to grass surfaces, to natural surfaces? And a lot of people feel that should be the case, that these artificial 3G, 4G pitches, as good as they are, they come with concerns over damage to joints and ligaments and the recurring sustaining injuries. But obviously they're in a lot of cases, very good all-weather surfaces that can withstand demands placed upon them that a natural grass pitch would never be able to manage in a consecutive number of hours or consecutive number of days of use. But then again, you go back and say, well, that's fine for preparing for a tournament, for training, but when it actually comes to competition and introducing an artificial surface into a league format, is that given the club that has this as their home pitch, is that giving them an unfair advantage? And I know in football there's a lot of people that really dislike the football pitches at Kilmarnock and Livingston, and I think there's certainly going to be some changes at one of those two grounds in the not too distant future because of the response that many of well, not exclusively because of the response, but in part due to the response of a number of the visiting teams and the governing body.
Yeah, and there are a lot of people, obviously, who are concerned about the injury side. I know there are some teams, some more than others, who really find it difficult. And I think if you're a player, particularly a prop or whatever, who's recovering from an injury, if you're on an artificial pitch, that could actually enhance the injury more. In fact, and there are concerns about that. There's even talk of some pitches which have gone to 3G going back to grass.
Oh, indeed. And if you think back to 1982, 1981, when Queen's Park Rangers and Luton Town were introducing artificial pitches, I mean, they look absolutely nothing like what the artificial pitches do look like these days. But the ones that we're talking about now have been around long enough for studies to have really produced the evidence to suggest, well, hang on a minute, we've looked at this over X number of years and we feel that there is a factor at play here where these surfaces could be detrimental to athletes because as I say, they've been around long enough now to establish a trend, to look at particular cases and track them over a period of time. And if there's a common feature, common factor all the way through, they say, well, this could be down to the surface these players are playing on. The common denominator is quite often the surface rather than a medical condition that many of these individuals have that makes them more susceptible to this type of injury. So, yeah, I mean, 3G pitches, 4G pitches, I mean, in the last 40 years, science has improved it immensely. And as you mentioned, at international level, that combination is absolutely fantastic, but is so expensive and can only really be afforded by those at the very, very top of the professional game, but again, whether it be in football or rugby.
Let's move on to the tournament itself. And as Phil Morris mentioned earlier in the programme, one of the big concerns from the locals in particular is the fact that we have guest teams. Not so much guest teams, but guest teams that don't mean a great deal to a lot of people. Like this year, for instance, we have the OG Sevens, we have Eric Liddell 100, and a few other names to the man in the street. They don't know who you're talking about. Whereas before you had your London Scottishes and your established names. What's your own thought on it?
Yeah, you go back to the late 80s, early 90s, and for a lot of people that was the almost the pinnacle of the Melrose Sevens. 5-6 years before the dawn of the professional game, the standard of sevens was really extremely high, so much so that they then introduced a World Sevens in 1993 that could have been at Melrose, that ended up being at Murrayfield, and there was a huge appetite for it. And it was, Northern Hemisphere sides against Southern Hemisphere teams. And in 1990, one of the teams that came across, Randwick, and David Campese in the side, and Michael Checa in the side. I think Mark Ella was part of that squad as well. And that tournament is a standout memory for so many people. That the quality of rugby was so high, the crowds were, a comfortable 5-figure crowd was inside the Greenyards during the course of the afternoon to watch that. It had a lot of television coverage at a prime time on a Saturday afternoon on terrestrial TV. And, there are many people still around to remember that and say, that was potentially, that had the potential to even build to even greater things. But that was probably the high point of the Melrose Sevens in relatively recent years. But of course, what's happened is with the professional game, you have just that. You have a portion of teams that are amateur teams that play the game socially, they enjoy it, they play with their friends, they keep it at an amateur level, but they take it very seriously at the level that they play at. And then you've got professional clubs that have now been long established that look and say, well, the Melrose Sevens was great during the period of the amateur era, but now as professional players we have other commitments that mean that we can't put together a squad of players that can commit to a Melrose Sevens. And even if they do put a squad of players together, is there such a gulf in class between the very best of maybe the local border amateur sides or the amateur teams from the cities against some of these professional clubs that will maybe scoop up a crop of some of the fringe players that are maybe age grade internationalists, and they come down and wipe the floor with the so-called amateur teams, because the physicality is greater, the technique is greater, that, as I say, the fitness levels are greater in that as well, and very often they don't have the preliminary round to feature in, so they've got one less tie to worry about. Now, it doesn't always work like that in the past, but that has left a big gulf in standards, and that has also been a criticism levelled at Melrose. And why do you bring these teams in that are going to wipe the floor with everybody else?
And of course this year they have changed it. There's no seeds, they say. Melrose are still, they've managed to get a bye, but interesting that the two finalists last year are both in the preliminary rounds, and that's going to be very, very interesting to see. But of course also in the preliminary rounds are your traditional local borders teams.
You always want to be part of the Melrose Sevens in the afternoon. I think one of the most disappointing factors for players is to go to the Melrose Sevens. It's still a great occasion to be part of it, to take to the field. But if you're out before lunchtime, that can be quite disappointing and quite disheartening for players, certainly. And I think that there will be an appreciation there that you've looked at the success of teams in the past, and just because of past achievements, they don't have a divine right then suddenly become teams in the first round proper without playing a preliminary round. Time was that a lot of teams, again using football as an example, Rangers and Celtic, would go into the first round of the Scottish Cup, and they could be paired with a Gala Ferradine or a Duns, as was often the case. But in more recent years it's been a case of they've featured in rounds 3 and 4, and they've not played in some of the earlier rounds. Now, a Melrose Sevens, a very different animal, of course, but I think a lot of people appreciate just throw everybody in and let's see what the draw produces.
And that's another thing as well, isn't it? That this year, and I think last year as well, if I'm right, suddenly the draw appeared. There was no public draw effectively, so no one could kind of witness. And I think when you don't do a public draw, you're opening up for various comments which have inevitably come.
And I think, again, because of a tournament that is effectively the Melrose, the birthplace of Sevens rugby, there was always an element of prestige about the draw to the Seven. Who are going to be the first two teams out of the hat? Who's going to kick off the tournament in 2024? So there was an element of intrigue, and a lot of people would want to know, when is the draw made? Where is it going to be made? I mean, I've covered the draw live. For Radio Borders some years ago. I went down, Douglas Hardy invited us down, and we were part of the live draw, and we could explain the draw and the format of the draw and how they were going to draw out the teams and where they were going to sit, whether it would be in the top half of the draw, the bottom half of the draw, and then you could shape up the afternoon, or at least the early part of the afternoon, by explaining the preliminary round, and then the winners of the early ties could then face X, Y and Z in the later rounds of the competition. So you could, by being there and by getting a feel and getting the reaction there and then, you could get a little bit of a sense. It was part of the story for that year, beginning to build momentum.
Now, I mentioned the guest teams earlier, and Bill McLaren, bless him, the late Bill McLaren, used to say that this was the toughest commentary that he ever had to do, simply because the amount of players involved, the amount of teams involved, and you've had this experience as well, and you'll have this experience again this coming Saturday. How do you deal with that?
Badly. How do I deal with it? I think You have to put your faith in a lot of other people.
Yeah.
And I mean that quite seriously. And I mean, we have had many conversations about this in the past, that you have to put your faith in those managers of the clubs, and every club attending will have somebody who will be responsible for the management of the players, and therefore that particular individual will have details of the players and presumably of the numbers of the jerseys that the players will be wearing. And you always put out an appeal to ensure that that information is accurate, so when they head into a changing room and you have received the squad of 10 and the numbers, and it doesn't have to be 1 to 10 for a sevens. You can have 15s jerseys, replacement jerseys, as long as the numbers and the players match up. But as we've said, some of the bright names in the game have been involved in this process, and somehow between going into the changing room and then coming out, something awry happened time and again, and it just goes to pot. And you then are scrambling around to try and establish the jersey changes, and that becomes very difficult when there are guest teams that you've never watched before and you're unable to necessarily identify by line of sight a lot of the players. So there is an element of trust, and there is a certain amount of homework you can do by accessing the teams and the players in advance. But of course, a lot of the players will travel at very short notice now to the sevens, so that opportunity isn't as great as it perhaps used to have been. And I don't know how Bill McLaren would have maybe felt about an Assassin's seven taken to the Greenyards. I could imagine that he'd have one or two sort of clever lines pre-planned that he would use. He wouldn't shoehorn them in, but he would use them as and when he could if the opportunity did arise.
Have you got a few lines lined up?
I've got an entire diatribe about Eric Liddell.
I bet you have. I was going to ask you about that. Tell us a story, because you and I were speaking earlier in the week, and we knew there was connections. There's a team called Eric Liddell 100, which presumably means he had some connection with the Melrose Sevens back in 1924. So that's the 100th anniversary of that. What have you been able to find out?
Well, the interesting thing is, did he have a connection specifically with the Melrose Sevens in 1924, or has he, in a roundabout way, using a road map, a connection with Melrose? Now, I think it's the latter. I can't see any direct thread to him having a direct connection with the Sevens specifically. Now, there was an Edinburgh school side, former pupil side, that played in 1923. I think, but it wasn't a school that Eric Liddell attended, so he wasn't part of the squad as far as I can see. But the connection with Melrose is it goes back, well, the Melrose part of the connection comes a little bit later, but in 1924, of course, Eric famously ran in the 400 metres in Paris, won the gold medal, finished with a bronze medal in the 200 metres, came back a celebrated hero, probably, you could say, Scotland's first real world sporting icon, certainly male icon, having achieved all of that in Paris in 1924. And there was a General Christensen who lived in Melrose from the late 1940s through to when he passed away at the age of 100. And he actually was the British Olympic team manager in 1924, and he was asked by the King George V to speak to Eric Liddell and try and persuade him to consider running in the 100 metre heats, famously held on a Sunday. And Eric Liddell, being a devout Christian, did not want to participate in any sport that was going to be held on a Sunday. And it got to the stage where General Sir Philip Christensen actually took Eric Liddell to meet the King. So Eric Liddell had an audience with George V, but he stood his ground and he said, well, no, I am opting to run the 400 metres because I do not want to take part in the heats because they are held on a Sunday. And as I say, General Christensen, famous for organising one of the very first Edinburgh tattoos back in 1947, 2 years later moved to Melrose and spent 51 years of his life, because he passed away at the age of 101, living in Melrose. And he set up the second part of his life out of the armed forces living in Melrose.
Well, I'm sure there's going to be more coming out of it from Melrose and that story as the weekend progresses. But going back to the format again, and some people have said, well, why don't you go back to having more of a club environment for the Saturday so that it gives obviously the locals a lot more chance to go further in the tournament? Yes, have your guest teams, etc., but possibly, I don't know, a Newcastle Falcons or a Durham University, something like that. I'm pretty sure that you would still get the same amount of interest and spectators would probably come back. Those who have kind of stopped going because there isn't this local element. Certainly in the latter stages. And then maybe, because you've got the 3G pitch, one of the pluses again of that is you could actually have a semi-pro professional tournament on the Sunday and make a real, festival out of it.
Yeah, I think the fact is, you used the word there, festival. I think, for a long, long time, it was a one-day event. It was a lunchtime through to early evening, and it was played as a one-off. It was an opportunity for supporters to come along and see in the flesh some of the very best Sevens players that they'd no opportunity of ever seeing on the television because there was no exposure on TV apart from the odd highlights reel that might have been on Grandstand or World of Sport. And as you say, I think that an element that has changed and has made it very different to what it was a few years ago is the fact that it's spread over a few days, and that does allow organisers to take a different approach. Have a particular tournament, age grade tournament on a Friday, keep the main event to the Saturday, but look as well at the Sunday and perhaps offer up something a little bit different. But I don't know if, how it works with insurances, if some of the professional sides, if there's an element where they would accept an invitation, but there has to be some insurance policy put in place to protect the players for playing in a tournament such as this. I don't know if that is even a factor or not, but I mean, it still has a long, rich history, and for certainly people of a certain age, it's one of those Saturdays that you mark down in the calendar. It often clashes with the Grand National, and sometimes some cup semi-finals are held on that day. So if the Masters is on that weekend, it can be one of several events and one of the best weekends of sport anywhere in the world that year. And that is certainly the case in 2024. There's so much going on this coming weekend, and the Melrose Sevens has its role to play in all of that over the weekend rather than just one day. So there is scope for it. As Phil Morris will know, you're not going to please everybody with whatever approach you decide to take.
Now, the one thing we can say is that quality rugby is guaranteed. There are some tremendous players. Okay, they might be hidden away amongst the unknown teams or the unusual named teams, but they will be there. And of course, last year we were all looking at Samurai, we were all looking at the British Army, and in comes Monaco Impies from nowhere to scoop the prize, and they're back here once again. Any tips this year?
I think it's a very open draw. I think, I've watched the British Army, 2 years ago now, produce some exceptional rugby to win the tournament. I think that the very point you made there about there's going to be one or two individuals that we're going to watch having little or no knowledge of his talents prior to the start of the tournament, and that's unusual in this day and age. And that's maybe the nice thing about Melrose Sevens, still being able to unearth some real quality that has gone maybe under the radar and are not necessarily players that you would see certainly not on terrestrial TV, but not on satellite television either. So that's one thing that it certainly has in its favour, and I think Monaco will fancy that they can repeat their success of last year. British Army will be looking to certainly produce a better performance and try and wrestle back the crown, the trophy they picked up a couple of years ago. But it's a hard one to call. I don't know if you'd say there's any out-and-out favourites. And just the very fact that there is no seeding maybe just adds a little extra layer of intrigue in terms of how these visiting teams will fare in the grander scheme of things.
Of course, Shogun are the new name for Samurai, who have made the final a couple of times, and Terry Sands, the man in charge there, is certainly throwing all his weight and considerable clout in terms of getting great players to turn out for Shogun. This is kind of like his third opportunity and maybe his last opportunity to get a win at the Melrose Sevens. And of course, he was inducted into the Hall of Fame a couple of years ago as well, and we were there for that one. So that's going to be very, very interesting. The big question, though, can a local team go all the way this year?
I don't see why not. I think that there's every opportunity if they, again, if the stars align, there's every opportunity. It's always difficult for a local side, that's starting from the very beginning. I mean, a team like Hawick, for instance, they've got so many other factors at play on Saturday, and their focus is, going to be split between the commitments at Melrose and a semi-final. So, their focus is certainly going to be in two different camps almost during the course of the afternoon. But I think there's one or two sides that will certainly fancy that they can have a good run in the tournament. Whether they can go all the way, it's a test of endurance as well as skill. Just quickly to go back to the Eric Liddell 100 select side, of course, it's youngsters, students made up of some of the best rugby sevens players at Edinburgh University. And of course, it's Eric Liddell studied at Edinburgh University, so there brings in a connection with Eric and with his academic years. So that's the background to the Eric Liddell Sevens, where they've recruited the group of 10 players from. They all come from Eric's former university, Edinburgh University. So we'll see what they can produce in the course of the afternoon. But I'd imagine that the longer the tournament goes with Borders' interest, particularly if you get to the quarterfinals and there's at least two sides, Border teams left in the competition, then there's going to be a bigger groundswell of support for those teams to try and get through to the real business end of the tournament. And then when you've got Border teams in the semi-finals, and dare I say, if one team does make the final, then it does completely change the complexion of the tournament and those that will watch it.
Well, you're certainly going to be a busy boy. There's going to be a lot of people out there, certainly in the press box as well. You'll be commentating for the BBC on the television as well. But you're also doing 4 or 5 ties, I think, for us early on. So we're looking forward to having you on board for that. And thanks very much indeed, as always, for your time.
No problem, Stuart. Thank you.
Good to hear from Stuart, and as well as doing the online television commentary for the BBC, he'll be covering some of the earlier ties with Dale and Robin and other members of our team as well. We're live from the Greenyards on Saturday from 11 till 8, also a special show at 5:30 on Friday, all the way through till 9, covering the Under-18 Sevens tournament, and that will be great fun to do again. Last year, the winners were Kelso Harlequins against Jed Thistle, 7-5 it was, and it also introduced us to some future stars, people like Mark Glenn from Jedforest and Archie Barber, who scored the winning try, and he's done so well that he was actually running out for the South of Scotland full team a couple of weeks ago. So exciting to go along and see these future stars.
Yeah, and I think it's vital that you do. You've got to kind of follow these stories through. You think back about one of your kind of most popular videos online was maybe not so much now, but it was obviously Stuart Hogg scoring that try for Scotland A so many years ago, but you'd already filmed them at Berwick Sevens and running out for Hawick YM, and that's what's happening here. You've got those players like Sir Mark Glenn, Archie Barber, who came through. There was Jack Utterson as well, and you've got to think about some of the other, like Nairn Moncrief. He's recently been playing for Scotland Under-18s.
Ross Wolfenden.
Alongside Ross Wolfenden. Chris Thompson, who is... who's been at Merchiston, is going to run out for the Peebles senior side this weekend, but obviously he was in the Colt side last year, so it's great to see the quality of these players coming through. And I think one thing that really has always surprised me, and it was probably how bad I was as a youngster, but is the quality of these young individuals coming through. The skill set and the level of them is far superior than what it used to be in terms of the collective as well, the skill set across the whole squad. So I thoroughly enjoyed covering it last year. Obviously the 7-5 doesn't sound like it was a great occasion, but it was a really good final. It was topsy-turvy, and obviously at the end it came down to that one kick. So obviously we'll be hoping for an equally competitive weekend of rugby on the Friday as well as the Saturday.
Well, that's it for this week. We're back with another podcast next Thursday, but until next week, from Dale and me, bye for now.